Hi, this is Carl Skinner, and I've been asked to talk with you about using prescribed fire in the management of California black oaks. And this is basically coming from my experience of using fire in black oak stands around the Shasta Lake area. Now, one of the first things we need to do when we're contemplating using fire somewhere is, what is it we actually want to do? Why do we want to use fire in a particular place? What do you want to accomplish? What is your purpose? Because you may want to use a different kind of fire for different kinds of purposes. So some of the reasons that we often try to use fire in these black oak stands and so forth are a number of them, and they are potentially for fire hazard reduction. You might want to create fuel breaks. One of the things we were doing mostly at Shasta Lake was for habitat improvement, and that had to do with creating more acorns and forage and dealing with pests. And then along with that, you may just have restoration in mind. You want to bring it back to a condition that is believed to have been historical in the area. And then once you have the kind of conditions that you want, you would need fire now and then to be able to maintain those conditions. So there's a number of reasons why you might want to use fire. There's more than this. And the main thing is that you need to set clear goals, which are where you want to end up, your desired conditions down the road, and then objectives for the particular burn you're contemplating doing at the moment, because it may not get you all the way to your desired conditions, but you need to know what you want to accomplish with that fire. Now, what type of fire would help you to achieve your goals then, once you have a sense of what your goals are? And would fire alone help you to achieve those goals? Now, if you look at a stand like this one, you see the conifers have advanced to the point that they're shading out the oaks. Most of the oaks in there are dead, like the one in the center of the image here. And there's not much you could do here to help oaks with a prescribed fire. There's other work that probably needs to be done. So it's not likely fire alone is your tool in this case. Here's another one where it's a very dense stand of oaks and conifers. And to achieve something that you might want to do here might take more than just a fire. But then you could get stands that look like this that are basically mostly oak already. And the main thing you want to do is to thin it. And that's what this particular burn is, the purpose of it in this stand is. Or you could look at stands like this, and fire can go a long ways to achieving your objectives here, because it's mostly very small conifers in the understory and some shrubs with larger trees that would not adversely impacted by using fire in there. So you could probably just use fire alone in a stand like this. And then obviously here, this is a stand that's pretty much in the condition that you want to get to, and fire would help you to maintain these conditions in a stand like this over time. Now, how many applications to get to where you want to go is an important question. If fire alone is what you want to use, or even if it isn't. In this stand again that I'm showing you, it may take more than one application of fire to actually thin it to the point that you have a few oaks that are going to become dominant and create larger crowns with acorn mass production that you're after, which is what we were after in this particular case. And so we didn't think we would get there all the way with one burn. And so it could take a few to get there. Here's another one. What you see is an oak stand that came up largely through what originally was a brush field. You can see the manzanita in the back there. And so the fire that we put through it essentially killed a lot of the manzanita. And that's in the understory now, and that's becoming fuel. And it will take another burn or two to be able to consume that before we get to conditions that we're after. And then in this particular situation in the lower right, what you see is a burn that a few years after it had been burned, that there's just a few seedlings of conifers in there. It's mostly dominated by oaks, and they're the larger oaks, and it's well on the way to being what it is that you desire it to become. Now, another important thing to think about when contemplating putting fire in oak stands is, what is the landscape context? Where are the stands in the landscape? And what kind of a landscape is it that you're working with? What you see here is a steep and complex landscape. This is in the McCloud River watershed. And you can see that it's a mixture of oaks and brush fields and conifer stands. And so it depends on the location of the oak stands and how they fit in with others as to you have access questions, you also have questions of what are the adjacent fuels and so forth, and can you take advantage of changes in aspect and shading and that kind of thing to potentially reduce your costs at the time that you do the burns, and do you actually have good access? And here's a landscape that is perfectly set up for doing oak burns, because what you see is the conifers are mostly in the bottoms of the canyons or on north and east-facing slopes in the draws, and the oaks are mostly on the upper two-thirds of the slopes and along the ridgetops. And so it makes it so that when we did most of our burning would have been in the fall and the winter, and that's when the sun comes through and gets to the surface fuels very well in the oak stands, but not so much in the conifers. They stay shaded, and so the context there really lends itself to burning the oak stands fairly practically with not worrying so much about the conifers. Season of burn makes a difference, and that's one of the things I was just talking about is first of all, the oaks are more sensitive to the fire in the springtime and early summer when they're actively growing, whereas in the fall and in the winter when they're going dormant or dormant, they're not so sensitive to the fire. And so the season of burn can go a long ways to minimizing the amount of damage that you do to the oaks themselves. You can also take advantage, like I showed in that previous one, say in a landscape of mixtures of conifers and oaks, especially if there are complex and changes in aspect and so forth, to be able to use the shaded areas of the conifers and changes in aspect to be able to limit what the fire will do and keep it into the oak stands where you're targeting. Again, this landscape here is one that's very well set up for that, and makes it so that the fall and winter season, because they're lower elevation stands anyway, the oaks have a tendency to burn fairly well if you have a number of days of drying in between rains, whereas the conifer stands would maintain shading and keep the fires from essentially going in there, and it limits the amount of line you have to construct and so forth. Now, our prescribed conditions. And now these are based on the late fall and winter burns that we did at the Shasta Lake Ranger District. And one of the things I want to emphasize with this is that flame length is key to getting good results. And what we found is that basically between 1 and 2 foot flame lengths is generally good, very good for getting the results you want. Occasionally, 2 to 3 feet is not a problem, but more than that could be, especially if it covers very much of the area. You can start negatively impacting the sensitive oaks. Now, air temperature on exposed slopes, we generally went up to about 70 degrees. On sheltered slopes, you might need it to get a little warmer to get to the point that you actually kill the understory that you're after. And relative humidity on exposed slopes, generally we worked with 30 to 60% humidity, and sheltered slopes 20 to 45% humidity because of the differences in solar shading and such. And it can really make a difference. The one thing about it on the sheltered slopes, though, is that once they can burn well, you know everything else will burn well. And so what we tried to do was to have the exposed slopes burned initially and then come back in later and do the sheltered slopes. And that way the fires were basically limited to the areas that we were targeted. Now some wind is good to dissipate heat and direct the fire. And I also like burning on slopes because slopes have to direct it as well. Fuel moisture. Generally we used we targeted 1 hour fuels less than 10%, 10-hour fuels of 9 to 15%. And surface litter, the oak leaves and such, were dry to the touch on the surface, but we liked to have the duff layer somewhat moist to touch. That seemed to give us the best chance of achieving the flame lengths that we were after. And then live fuels were generally less than 90% because of the timing of the year that we did our burning. Firing patterns. Now again, flame length is key, and whatever firing patterns you use, you adjust them to achieve the flame lengths that you want. And so that depending upon time of day, the amount of dryness, temperature and stuff, everything, you moderate everything or work with it in such a way as to achieve the appropriate flame lengths. And in that regard, on exposed slopes, we looked at, say, humidities of 45% plus. We often would use head fire. If it was 35 to 45%, strip head fires seemed to work fairly well. And then less than 35%, we would often use backing fires in the stands to get similar kind of results. On sheltered slopes, as you can see, we needed lower humidities to essentially get the same kind of results that we were after. The other thing to remember when you're working in oaks is that the different types of fuels you might encounter along the way can affect the way that the fire spreads and the flame lengths. And what you see on the lower right hand there is pretty much a uniform kind of situation under almost a pure oak stand with just oak litter as the main carrier of fire. On the left-hand side, what you see is oak stands with scattered pines in them. And what happens in that kind of a situation is that the pine needles have a tendency to, because of surface area to volume ratio differences with the oak leaves, they'll have a tendency to burn a little more intensely than the oak under the same conditions. And you can have the flame lengths increase, as you can see around the base of the pine there, what's happening compared to the oak, how the fire is spreading in just the oak leaves and such in that area. We also found where we worked, we had a lot of California steerax in the understory, and we found that something about the steerax, the way the oak leaves would kind of be more loosely compacted in it instead of just a layer on the forest floor, that when the fire would get into the steerax, the flame lengths would generally almost double from what they were in the outside area. So just something to look and things to watch over time, but it's a small shrub that most time people just kind of ignore, but we found that it made quite a difference in terms of the way fires burned. An important thing to do after burning is to evaluate the burn and not just burn it and figure, okay, we did that, and then walk away from it. You need to essentially be able to go back in and see, how did you do? Did you achieve your objectives? And if so, great. If not, what might you do in the future to improve what you were doing? And you can see here in this stand in the photo that where the fire had gone through about a month before, that there's a lot of leaves on the ground already that are showing up. Basically and this is a fall burn, and essentially what that's an indication of is that the crowns are alive. They are shedding their leaves like they normally would, and getting rid of leaves that have been scorched, that kind of thing. But the branches are actually still alive. The crowns are still alive. If they hang on to the leaves for extended periods of time, or like through the winter, where they would normally have dropped, then those limbs that hang on to leaves basically are dead. And they were scorched to the point that you kill those particular limbs. And it depends on how much of the tree you did that to, as to how much of the crown would be left. That's one thing to look at. And so that's the dropping of leaves is important. Another thing to look at is the bark, and how smooth is the bark afterwards. And you can see here there's still a lot of crevicing in the bark, and it hasn't smoothed out too much. There's a little bit around the base, but it's pretty much, you can tell that the bark is fairly well intact. And if we chopped into this particular tree, and this is what you ended up seeing, it's basically fairly well intact underneath. Is right under this crevice, you can see some damage to the cambium, but most of it's still very healthy underneath there. So this tree was fine. Where if the bark becomes much more smooth and you don't see the crevicing as well as you do here, the more likely you have cambium damage underneath. And the smoother the bark gets, the more damage there is, and it depends, and how the tree fares from that depends on how much of the circumference is smoothed out. And then if you come back in about a year later or so and see how the stands are doing, you can see in both of these cases that things are greening up underneath, and you can see now what the height of any crown scorch was in there. You can see back here where there were some shrubs that were killed and they're resprouting underneath, and this dead area in here, which is the crowns of this is brewer's oak, by the way, that was in the understory here. And then in this one in the lower right, what you have is you can see some manzanitas that were killed in this, that were in the understory. The grasses are coming back well, and you can also tell what the crown scorch height was, and that actually the stand could use another burn fairly soon to be able to help thin it some more, because we didn't thin it as well as we had wanted. So those are all things to keep in mind in terms of evaluating the burn and determining when you might want to burn again, and how well you achieved your objectives. I hope this is helpful. What you see in this photo here on the end, by the way, is the side on the left side of the trail had been burned. On the right side of the trail had not been burned. You can see the differences in those stands, how much conifer is on the right side compared to the upper side. So the upper side is on its way to achieving the objectives we want. The lower side needs some work unless you want the stand to succeed to conifer. So that's what I've got for now, and I hope it's helpful for you, and have fun.